In this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley, we're going to be talking about featherstick wood choice, remedying chips in an axe edge, and washing down sleeping bags and hydrophobic down. Welcome to episode 74 of Ask Paul Kirtley, where I answer your questions about bushcraft, survival and outdoor life. And if you've not listened to or watched an Ask Paul Kirtley before, I'm Paul Kirtley. What I do for a living is teach bushcraft and wilderness skills. I'm also a qualified mountain leader and a qualified canoe leader. So I bring a lot of different aspects to my thoughts on the outdoors and share my experience and knowledge with you the best I can in answering these questions. And if you want to ask a question on Ask Paul Kirtley, you do it via my blog at paulkirtley.co.uk. If you go to that place and click on Ask Paul Kirtley, or just go straight to paulkirtley.co.uk/Ask Paul Kirtley, you'll find out more there about how to ask a question. There's 4 ways basically. You can send me an email, you can leave a voice message, you can make a public post on Twitter using the hashtag AskPaulKirtley, and you can make a public post, video or photograph on Instagram using the hashtag AskPaulKirtley. Don't send me direct messages on Facebook and whatnot. I will find those difficult to collate later on. There's 4 very easy ways of making sure that I see things when I search. Either they go to my inbox via a voice message or an email, or they are easily searchable on Twitter or Instagram when I search on the special hashtag. So there's 4 ways there that you can ask a question, and I'll do my best to answer it on Ask Paul Kirtley. So, questions today are, first off, this is a voice message from Vince. Let me just see if I can get this to work.
Hi Paul, Vince Leroy here. First of all, just like to start by saying thanks very much for all the invaluable information you impart. It's very much appreciated. My question is regarding feathersticks. Now, I've done feathersticks with you on the elementary course. But my question is regarding the materials that you would use for feathersticks, i.e. are there certain woods that are very good and some trees that you would avoid making feathersticks from? Thanks very much. All the best.
All right, so question from Vince there about feathersticks. And Vince did an elementary wilderness bushcraft course with me earlier in the year. He did another course with me last year. He's pretty into his firelighting. He's pretty knowledgeable on his trees as well. So that's a really good question to help further his knowledge. Featherstick. So generally what we want is something that's dead, something that's dry, and something that's standing. And I know Vince knows that, but let's just start from the beginning for most people's benefit. Dead, dry, standing wood. Standing because it's going to be less wet than if it's lying on the ground, or if it's lying at an angle, there's going to be less moisture in there from rain or snow or what have you. So dead, dry, standing. And then what we're looking for in terms of the specifics of the materials, we want material that's quite straight grained, because we're going to split that material out and we're going to carve those nice curls. And if you're not familiar with what a featherstick is at all, I'll link to an article on my blog about making feathersticks, where you can get some more idea on how to make feathersticks, the carving skills, and a couple of tips and tricks there for you. And I'll link that in the notes below the videos, whether it's on YouTube or my blog. And I'll also in YouTube put a link at the top there. And so if you're listening to this on a podcast, any of the links that I talk about, you can go to paulkirtley.co.uk / and then go to the episode Ask Paul Kirtley 74. You can always do that, Ask Paul Kirtley 74, whichever episode we're talking about. Just as a general rule, you can do that. So if you're listening, you just go to that episode and there's a short link there that you can go straight to that, or just find it on my blog. And below the video and below the audio player will be any links that I talk about in here. So just to remind you that any links that I talk about, whether they're on my sites or other people's websites around the web, I will collate them all together there. So you don't have to be making notes or trying to scribble them down while you're on the bus or driving. Hopefully nobody's making notes while they're driving. And wherever you're listening to this as a podcast, you can go straight to my blog when you get the chance and get all of the links for further reading, further watching, further study, if you wish. So just to remind people about that, particularly if you're new to Ask Paul Kirtley. So feather sticks, you want straight grained wood, and I will put a nice article there on my blog for you to see about making them. And then you also want knot-free wood if possible. And if there are knots in the wood, because it's often difficult to get completely knot-free wood, most species of tree have some sort of side branches at some point in their lives, and therefore there are going to be some knots in there. If you have a knot, you basically want to cut the rounds of wood that you're using so that the knot is at one end and the rest is pretty clear of knots. Little pin knots are not going to be too much of an issue once your skills are okay and your knife is sharp. But if you've got any larger knots, I would have them at the top end of the stick if possible, where you're going to be holding it. So you're not going to be shaving there anyway because your hand's going to be there. So that first couple of inches, or 4 centimeters, can have a knot in it. It's not a problem because that's where your hand's going to be and you're not going to be bringing the knife there. But the rest wants to be straight grained and relatively knot free. So that then gives us some indications to the species we might want to look for. So things like Scots pine. So let's talk about this side of the Atlantic specifically at the moment. Scots pine, sort of dead standing small Scots pine trees are really good because they tend to grow with pretty straight grained, knot-free sections between where most of the knots are. Things like lodgepole pine tend to do the same as well on the other side of the Atlantic. Pinus banksiana, though, jack pine is a lot more knotty and contorted. White pine would be a better option, for example. So there's pines on both sides of the pond where a lot of listeners are to this podcast, where you're going to find pines, for example, dead standing small pines that are going to provide you with the good materials. And also you may get the benefit of them being quite resinous as well. That fat wood that people seem to prize could give you an added advantage as well. But primarily you want it dead, dry standing, straight grained and relatively knot free. And you can cut between those knotty sections and get that nice straight grained bit. Some of the spruces will give you similar sections, but they tend to be a lot more knotty. They tend to be a lot more branched when they're small. The classic kind of Christmas tree, for example. Things like balsam fir and some of the silver firs will give you some nice sections as well. If we're talking about the needled species. Some of the larches, the Larix genus, larches, tamaracks, they tend to be quite knotty as well and not so great. Better options would be, say, cedars, eastern white cedar, western red cedar. Even though they've often got small pin knots in there, you can get nice straight grained sections. And you know how nice, if you've used cedars at all, you know how nicely it splits and it carves really finely. You can make really wonderful feather sticks from cedars. In terms of the deciduous species, willow tends to be quite good, tends to be quite fine wood that carves quite nicely. But even fairly coarse grained, quick growing species like sweet chestnut, you can make half decent feather sticks with, and actually they're quite good for practicing for some of the Pinaceae species as well, because they split in a similar way and often have a similar grain structure, so they're quite good to practice with. Things like lime are nice, although you don't see that so often. You could even use sycamore, dead standing again, although that can be a bit brittle. Birch doesn't work super well, although you can make some okay feather sticks with birch. So there's lots to lots to play with there. I would avoid things like hawthorn, blackthorn, the fruit woods, you know, apple, pear, all of the hardwoods that are quite contorted in the way that they grow. Elder doesn't really lend itself, you know, some of the prunus, things like cherries. Yeah, you know, Prunus avium would work okay, although there's a lot nicer things you can do with that generally, and you don't often find dead standing bits. You know, if we're thinking about things we're going to find out in the wilder places, I'd look at pines, I would look at willows, I would look at maples, I would look at cedars in particular, and they're going to give you some good straight sections where you've got dead standing stuff. So good places to start. Have a play with all of those, and then we'll see if we can think of some more for you. And don't forget to check out that article on making feather sticks. Okay, this is a post on Instagram from Mick Mercer about remedying a chip or a couple of chips in his axe edge. So there's a picture there where Mick has taken a couple of little almost symmetrical dinks out of his axe. And he asks, I recently used my axe on a multi-day trip and somehow managed to put a big dent in the cutting edge. My questions are, in what way is the axe performance degraded by such damage? Does the entire nick need to be sharpened out, or will the axe perform well with it still having a small nick once sharpened? I sharpened the nick out as a personal punishment for making such a mess of the axe, as I'm sure I could have avoided it. I thought of doing the whole job with a 6000 grit just to make the point to myself, but in the end went through the grits. Still took a long time. Thanks, Mick. Okay, well, first off, Mick, I think you've been a bit hard on yourself. That's not a particularly large dink in an axe edge. I've seen much worse. That's a little nick really, and nothing much to worry about. Maybe you were being hard on yourself because you know how you did it and you realize, okay, well, I've hit some stones or whatever that you've hit, and that's caused me to do that, and you feel a bit silly for doing that. That's fair enough, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. Of course we want nice edges on our cutting tools, but in terms of your day-to-day, I'm just looking back at the picture, in terms of your day-to-day use of the axe for things like splitting, you know, firewood around camp, roughly hewing, camp utensils, making spoons and ladles, and you know, all the things around camp, that's not going to affect things too much. Even felling, you know, it's not going to affect things too much. And I've had nicks like that. Sometimes they appear and you're not quite sure how they've appeared, and basically I just remove them over a number of sharpens, because what I don't want to do is shorten the life of my axe dramatically by taking a millimetre off the edge just because there's a tiny little nick in there. So generally I would just sharpen it a number of times when it's needed and remove it that way. If you really do need to remove a nick while you're out and about, or even in your shed, in your workshop, I'd use a file. I'd use a metal file to start off with, and you can use a coarse one to start off with and then a finer one, and then you can move back to your stones. Do be careful about taking material off symmetrically though. You don't want to end up with an asymmetrical cross section to your axe bevel. You want to make sure that it stays nice and centered, that edge not being offset on your general purpose bushcraft outdoor axes, as it were. There are some really extreme ways of getting rid of dinks if you put big dinks in, so in terms of rubbing the edge on a stone or on a file to take it right back down again and then sharpening it up again. But for the size of dink that you've got there, it's definitely not necessary. One thing I would note though is whenever you're sharpening, make sure you're taking metal off the whole bevel where it's shiny there. Don't just take metal off towards the edge, because you'll end up changing the blade profile. The axes that we tend to use, the general purpose axes like the Gransfors, the Vetterlings or the Hultafors, etc., they tend to have convex bevels, and if you just sharpen them like your bushcraft knife, where you're taking the stone to the edge, close to the edge, you're going to end up with a flattened secondary bevel on that, and that's going to make it harder to sharpen in the long run. It might also make it more, depending on exactly what angle you set that at, you might end up making it more prone to dinks as well. You want to keep that convex shape. So what you need to do is make sure you're taking metal off the whole bevel by varying the angle using your sharpening stone. And people keep asking me about axe sharpening, and I really should do a video on it before too long. So I will try and get that made in the coming months on using a small stone like the Gransfors stone, or a Falcon even TK4, even a DC4 even, for sharpening your small forest axe, for example. I think that would be useful to a lot of people. Axe sharpening seems to be an area that some people struggle with, so I will add that to my list of things to make in the not too distant future, I hope. Well, thanks for the question, Mick. This question is from Sebastian von Overheit, and this is sent to me via email. And his question is, hi Paul, first of all, I'm a huge fan of your YouTube channel and can't thank you enough for sharing your experience and knowledge with all your viewers. I'm originally from Germany and have been hiking and backpacking in the south of Bavaria for many years. Since 2015, I live in Vancouver, Canada, so I've got another level of nature and adventures to explore right on my doorstep. I'm constantly expanding my skills and knowledge, and your videos and podcast is an amazing source of knowledge. To my question, in your episode, Lightening the Load Part 1, sleeping systems, you clearly advised against trying to clean or wash a down sleeping bag at home, but to give it to a professional cleaning service instead. Could you share some of your experiences on that subject? I've got a Mountain Hardware Ratio 15 with hydrophobic down, and my old La Fuma down sleeping bag I've treated with Nikwax Downproof after washing it at home with Nikwax Down Wash Direct. I have to mention that I have a front loading washing machine and a dryer at home, and put the recommended tennis balls in the dryer as well. All seems fine so far, I think, but it was the first time I've done it, and I'd be grateful to hear any further details about your concerns. If you have any thoughts on hydrophobic down in general, I'd be interested to hear those as well. Thank you, Sebastian. So there's a number of questions in there, but they all centre on whether it's sensible to wash your down bag at home, or whether or not you should take it or send it to a professional cleaning service. And so my experiences with that are that over time, down bags, when you use them, tend to reduce in their performance as the down becomes matted with dirt, with grease, and that will be from you, and it will be from the environment, and then they lose their warmth, and that can be a season or two's warmth that's lost from the bag over time if you let them get really dirty. So the first thing, just as a general point, not so much for Sebastian, but this is a general point for listeners, is do make the effort to try and keep your sleeping bag clean. Whether you're using a down bag or a synthetic bag, any sleeping bag will reduce in performance if it is dirty, because it doesn't loft as well and it doesn't hold as much air, and therefore you won't stay as warm. So that's why we're interested in cleaning bags as well as keeping them clean. I find they get most dirty most quickly around the hood. I do tend to use a silk sleeping bag liner in down bags, not so much in summer weight bags because I'm often too warm in that combination, or I'm just trying to be super lightweight, and I will just reduce the weight even further. But the other advantage that a silk bag liner gives you is that you can pretty much just sleep in the silk bag liner if you want to as well. So it depends on what you're going for. Winter bags, I tend to use a silk liner as well. I'll certainly take a silk liner, and that will increase the warmth as well as keep it clean for longer. So where you're where your liner isn't is where your face and your head is, and clearly you're not necessarily washing your hair every day and face every day on a trip, etc., and you're going to be a bit more greasy than you are at home when you're showering every day perhaps, and that puts quite a lot of muck into that part of the sleeping bag. And you can see the hood, the hood area and above the baffles tends to get quite greasy, and it tends to mat down more than the rest. But over time the rest of the bag will reduce in performance as well. And so I've cleaned quite dirty sleeping bags in my washing machine at home, and it doesn't get that grease out as well as sending it to a professional service. It just doesn't. And in fact, one occasion I tried to clean a 4-season down bag in my washing machine at home, and it came out sort of half clean. It also took me about 3 days to get the thing dry after using it, and the down was all clumped, and I kept having to unclump it and it was hung outside in quite sunny weather, and it still took several days to get properly dry and properly lofted. I had to regularly sort of unclump the down. So there's there's sort of an irritation factor there. Yes, you can put them into tumble dryers and sort of fluff them up that way, but even so, you need to be careful with them because they are quite delicate. The contents are quite delicate, and the down can clump together and stay clumped together, so you often end up having to sort of prise it apart. And even so, to cut a long story short, it still needed sending off to the cleaners because I wasn't happy. And I was using Nikwax, and it does work. I think the Nikwax down material, the down cleaner, works well on down jackets that are quite small, and I think it works well enough on 2 to 3 season sleeping bags, although, as I say, if they're particularly dirty, they don't tend to come out as clean as if you use a professional cleaning service. And so once you get onto the larger bags, they tend to be too heavy with too much down to wash in a domestic washer anyway, and they take a long time to get dry, even in warm conditions. When you can get them out in the sunshine, I've found that you've had to sort of unclump them manually, and it's also a waste of time that I could be doing something else with, frankly. So for all of those reasons, while yes, it is possible to wash your own lightweight 2 to 3 season hiking down bags at home and probably put them in the tumble dryer, frankly I just find it easier to send them to a professional cleaning service. They come back like new, they smell nice, they're fully lofted, there's no grease, there's no dirt, and it's like having a brand new bag again, when it was looking pretty grim before I sent it. And it costs not too much money at the end of the day. In the UK, the service that I use, it costs about £35 to have one cleaned, and I don't do it that often. As I say, I try and use a silk liner with those bags, which extends how often, that extends between the periods you have to clean them. So having tried both, I just like to send them off. I know that I'm going to get a consistent service. It doesn't take any of my time. Yes, I have to pay for it, but it doesn't take up a lot of time in terms of managing the wash, managing the drying, managing the re-lofting of the bag. It is just a time versus money thing for me, as well as fundamentally you get a consistent result with any of your bags, whether they're lightweight or heavyweight, from getting them sent off to a professional cleaning service. So that's my thinking on that. Hydrophobic down as well, I would just be a bit careful about cleaning that in a domestic washing unit as well, because hydrophobic down is treated in a certain way. So without giving generalized rules, I would look at the manufacturer's recommendations for cleaning for those bags, because the more technical the material, the more carefully you often have to treat it, or the more specifically the treatment, the washing, the reproofing, if you like, needs to be. So I would look at what the recommendations are of the manufacturer and follow those, frankly. So that brings us to the end of episode 74 of Ask Paul Kirtley, and I will look forward to answering more of your questions on Ask Paul Kirtley episode 75 before too long. And if you are listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, please remember to subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, please remember to subscribe if you'd like to hear or watch more Ask Paul Kirtleys, and please like this video as it will help other people see it too. Much appreciated. Thank you very much, and I look forward to receiving more of your questions going forwards. Take care and enjoy the outdoors.